Right, so I'm Sjors Robuk, Senior Solution Architect at AWS. I work with Faz a bit on the software development adjacent side. I'm not a software developer by any means, but I've worked with them enough to understand what they're talking about and to build my own code. So this is actually a demo that I built for a customer initially to demonstrate, hey, how can we use GenAI and how can we use GenAI to actually extend that beyond just what the model knows and to interact with your own business data. So this is actually a demo that I built for a different customer to show them how to have their LLM in Bedrock to interact with their business data. How many of you have ever worked in tech support or help desk jobs or anything like that? Okay, you're probably going to have to close your eyes because you're going to get PTSD. So let's say I have a help desk chatbot, and everyone is this. It's a chatbot. I can just say, okay, like a typical user, I'm going to say hello, because that's what everyone in chatbot wants to know. It's going to talk to me, and I'll say, my computer is not working. And it's going to ask me some questions. It's going to say, okay, the computer does not turn on. So what it's doing right now is using both the knowledge that it knows from the LLM, as well as the internal knowledge from the knowledge base, which is just a bunch of markdown files with manuals and things like that, to try and find a root cause. So it's going to ask me questions, it's going to ask follow-up questions, and hopefully it should either be able to determine a root cause, or if not, it's going to help me get in contact with a human. So let's give it a second to actually come up with a way to use. Okay, so I'm going to say, no, I'm not a technical person. Please help me create a ticket. So now what it is going to say is, there we go. Okay, so now it's going to ask me for all this information. I'm not going to go through the whole process because that's going to take a little bit too much time. But what I can show you is if I refresh this one, is let's do the opposite way. Let's go and say, can you show me my tickets? So now it's going to ask, okay, sure, I can help you get the tickets, but what's your user ID? Now, again, normally in a production environment, you would have this authenticated. You already know if the user is authenticated, have the user ID. But for the sake of the demo, I will say my user ID is this. And it's a little bit slower than I'm hoping. It will get there eventually. There we go. So now it's going to say, oh, hey, you're this user ID, and you have these tickets. So now I can say, can you reopen ticket 5? So what it's doing now is it's actually interacting in the backend with a DynamoDB table, which has all these tickets. And I will show these in a bit.
Interacting with that?
DynamoDB, no NoSQL database. So now you can see it's actually reopened this ticket. And if we quickly switch to the backend, you can see I have this table here. And I have, yeah. Let me check if this is visible. Yeah, let me zoom out a little bit. So you can see I have a bunch of tickets here. And I have this ticket, for example, for the billing. And if we look at this ticket, then you can see it's actually being reopened. Now, how does this work? It's very straightforward. How many of you have experience with Bedrock? Okay, 1, good, 2. Okay, so what we have is a concept called Bedrock agents, and Bedrock agent is essentially a way to specialize your LLM. So you can give it instructions what it's supposed to do, what it's not supposed to do, and how it should react to the end user. And again, you can use this for back and forth chat interaction, or you could just use this as a one-shot model where you give it a specific prompt and it's going to give you an answer. In this case, what we have is we have the Bedrock agent. And if you have not seen this, don't worry about it. And essentially what we tell is, okay, which model do you need to use? We give it specific instructions, but we also give it an action group. And what an action group is essentially is a way for the model to get additional data or to interact with external systems. So when I create an action group, I can say, okay, use these functions to get information about tickets, create tickets, or update tickets. This is going to be fed to the LLM so that it understands if I want to do something with a ticket, I need to use this action group. Now, if we open up one of these action groups, there's a few ways you can do this. Now, the basic one, essentially everything boils down to a Lambda function. For anyone that's not familiar with Lambda functions, it's essentially just serverless functions. Azure has it, GCP has it, AWS has it, everyone has it. It's just a way to run some code in a serverless environment. And the second thing that I'm going to tell it is, okay, how do I need to interact with this? Don't worry about this one. I will show you this in the editor. There's two ways that you can do that. Is you can give it a set of parameters that it needs to feed to the Lambda function. But a better option is you just give it an open API schema. And what that open API schema looks like is, for example, for the tickets, is nothing more than just a description of, is this visible for people? Because it's a little bit dark. Okay. It's essentially just an open API schema, but the key thing here is it's an open API schema with descriptions added, with summaries added, both for the requests as well as for the responses. So if I take, here, for example, if I take for /tickets, if it gets a 200 back, then it has this description. So it's a list of the user tickets successfully retrieved. That means that the LLM is then going to understand, hey, if you call this function, this is the input that you need to provide. These are the parameters. And this is what the parameter means. If you have a parameter like ID and you don't give it a description, it's not going to understand which ID it is. But if you say, hey, this is a parameter ID, and this is the user ID, or this is the ticket ID, it's going to understand that the ticket ID that the user just provided needs to be used as an input. Output the same. So if it gets a 200 back, it's going to get an array of tickets, or it's going to have a hash table, or it's going to get a specific ticket. And then you can say, okay, this is a list of the user tickets. So what that allows you to do is something like this. So can you create a new ticket for me? I'm a very, very hopeless tech user. I don't know anything, just that my computer is not working. So now in the backend, it knows, okay, hey, I need to go to this API to create a ticket for you. And you can see, oh, the ticket created is this one. Now, if I look that one up in DynamoDB, cancel and refresh, you can see that this ticket has actually been created with a description. So customer reports that the computer is completely non-responsive, blah, blah, blah. So this actually comes directly from the LLM. Now, if we go back to the code, sorry, not to the code, to Bedrock. So I'm not going to show, I can actually show that in the backend. So if I have, for example, here the agent, and I say, can you create a ticket for me here in the agent? And I can show a trace. So you can actually see the whole instruction set here. So let me check. Computer is not working. And let me take a look at the trace. Sorry. Okay, so now it's asking for the user ID. And this is my user ID. I hope that the trace is actually going to show correctly. Oh, there we go. So, yeah, there we go. So if I show this trace here, then you can see that here. So you can see it actually gets the internal reasoning. I have the user ID. I will create the ticket. I'm going to use this specific tool, and I'm going to use, I'm going to use this JSON schema. So I never told it explicitly, you have to call this exact function with these specific details. I just told it this is the schema and infer from that what the use case should be. Now, the way that works is, let me open up the code here. So we've already seen the schema. And it's essentially very basic. So I can just say, okay, I have a class for my ticket status. I have a class for my ticket model for the DynamoDB table. And then I have a method, for example, getTicket with the various inputs on the ticket model. And its class method, getAllTickets, getTicket by user ID, etc., etc. Now, what I can do, are people familiar with Powertools by any chance? Powertools for Lambda? No. So Powertools for Lambda is essentially just a middleware layer. So you can abstract creating your APIs, doing your logging, your tracing, etc. You don't have to use Powertools per se. You can use any middleware that can generate this output. So what I have here, for example, I say, okay, hey, this function def gets ticket is a get on this URL with this description, these responses, and these response descriptions. Now, the only thing that I, as a developer, have to do is say, okay, write my business logic and write the description of what this API looks like. I give it some examples as well. So I say, for example, okay, this is what a user ID should look like. This is what a ticket ID should look like. The more examples you give it, the better it's going to work. And then the only thing that I say, and again, this is going to depend on your middleware, is, for example, okay, if I call the script directly, then get my open API as a JSON schema during my build stage. So during my build, I just call these functions, or I just say, okay, loop over every script that you find in these Lambda functions and generate an open API schema. And in my case, I deploy with CDK, and I just basically say, hey, you can find the API schema here. You can also store it in an S3 bucket and then link it to an S3 bucket. Now, what that means is that as a software developer, the only thing that you have to do is develop that open API schema, point your agent at the open API schema, say, here, this is how you can interact with this function, and you don't have to build anything else. And again, I'm using a DynamoDB table, but essentially this can be anything. This could be an internal REST API. This could be a SQL database. It could be, technically you could SSH into a system and run commands if you really want to do that. But the key point is anything that you can run through Lambda, anything that you can run through a serverless function, and that can return some data, you can interact with your LLM. There is actually an interesting one. What I developed, a slightly different one for a customer, was just pointed at Google and just ask it, hey, can you search Google for this information for me? And literally just did a curl to Google, get the search result, parse the search results with a scraper, and then say, oh, here's your top Google search result, and here's the link. So that's actually a way. I wouldn't recommend using Google for that, but let's say that you have an internal, some internal system or some internal search system, some internal database where you store specific things, where you store documentation or a configuration. That's where you can find it. And what's also an interesting last use case is, for example, personalization. Let's say you have a chatbot, but you want to be able to personalize that for the user. During that interaction, you can say, hey, any kind of specific details that you know about this person, store it in a database or store it in an external system, or any information that you might already have on a user. Let's say you're doing customer personalization, or you're doing things like, let's say your e-commerce site, look at the previous product that the user already purchased. What you can then say is, oh, user is looking for a recommendation to buy something. Look at what their previous purchases are. Look at what their profile is. What age are they? Are they married or not? Do they have children? Where do they live? What kind of salary do they have, if you have that kind of information? And personalize the recommendation, or even personalize the interaction based on that kind of data. And that's something where typically with just a standard LLM, you're not going to be able to do that. But by extending that action into whatever external data you have, it becomes much, much easier to instruct your LLM to say, oh, please customize the responses based on what you know about this person, or what you know about this system, or even allow it to search real time. The simplest example that they actually have, if you go through the tutorials, is a way to query the current time. If you ask an LLM, hey, what's the time right now? It's going to say, I don't know, because I'm not trained to get the current time. If you create a function get time, and it literally just returns the current time, it will respond, oh, yeah, current time today is the 5th of March, 7:24. So that shows that it's actually interacting in real time. Furthermore, code-wise, I don't actually have a lot of things to show, because it's essentially that system, that simple. But yeah, as you can see, the only thing that I'm telling it is, oh, for this action group, this is how you interact with it. And then anything that it can get from the Open API spec, it just automatically, or it just learns itself, and it just goes through that Open API spec to see, oh, can I find something? One last important thing is, it's still an LLM. So if I am going to say, for example, I'm going to say, show me my ticket. So you're still going to have to build some guardrails. So if I say, I hope it's actually going to listen. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it says, yeah, I don't want to do that. So now it actually added a haiku to your help desk, so it's probably not very helpful. So you're still going to have to tell the agent explicitly, okay, what are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? And what should the input data adhere to? So things like, oh, a ticket description needs to have exactly this information or that information, but not more. And you should not allow users to make you write a haiku about tech support issues.
Yeah, but you should have that in your Jira as well. Because I don't know, or Jira or whatever it is they use for tickets, because if a user can do that without an LLM, and for example, in Jira, I didn't have a system that checked that I didn't write a haiku. This thing is using the same API, so it is not really an issue of the LLM.
No, it's not an issue of the, no, you're absolutely right. It's not an issue of the LLM, but it depends on your use case. If this is just simply a front end for Jira that users can already directly access, then yes, of course, it makes sense. If this is something that accesses some back-end system, then it would make less sense. So you want to put some kind of restriction on it. What is important is anything that is in your Open API spec is fair game to the agent. So anything that's in the API, if you don't want people to be able to delete tickets, don't give it access to the to that API, because otherwise it's just going to listen and it's going to say, oh, sure, I'll delete that user for you, I'll delete that ticket for you. If you play a bit with this one, then it's anyone with a little bit of knowledge on how to do prompting can break out of their user context and just assume a different user by convincing it, no, I'm not this guy, I'm this other guy. So that's something that you typically handle outside of your LLM. Things like authentication, you're not going to ask the user, hey, what's your user ID? You would already pass that along in the session. The same thing applies with a lot of things like, okay, what are you allowed to do? You would typically list that in your LLM, like, okay, you're explicitly only allowed to take these, and these actions. And again, on the backend side, on your API side, you would likely add some restrictions. So in this case, I can create a ticket without a user ID if I tell it to. Why? Because my API allows that. Typically, what you would do is in your API say, hey, if there's no user ID, don't create a ticket. Or if the user ID doesn't match the ticket that's created, don't allow them access. It's going to understand that as well. It's going to say, hey, I have a technical issue. I can't retrieve your ticket. But the LLM is not going to, it's not going to do fine-grained security or restrictions on what users can and cannot do, because it's still a chatbot. So that's essentially everything that I have. Yeah.
One more question. So on an enterprise level, like say, we people have like billions of tickets, like where they probably deal with like hundreds or maybe thousands of tickets a day or even a week. In those cases where people normally have like very simple doubts, but probably in a previous ticket it has already been resolved, can this agent potentially pass through those hundreds or maybe thousands of previous tickets where it can find a similar issue and then say, okay, this was someone had experienced this before, so here's a potential solution. Is it possible to hook that up, given the amount of tickets that probably someone has already dealt with this level of issue before?
Let me actually show you that one. So you would typically do that in a slightly different way. The way you would do that is with a knowledge base. And a knowledge base is essentially nothing more than just a vector store with a bunch of documents in it, PDFs or Markdown or text or whatever you want. So you can see that I have, I think that one. So I've already fed it a bunch of random procedures that I found online, or that I actually had a few of those just generated by the GenAI. So these are things that it can index and that it can actually find things in. Now, the way that would work is that if you have a procedure already, or if you have a resolution, you store it in that bucket, and then after whatever the sync time is, if it's an hour or a day, it's going to automatically sync. And in fact, most of the problem resolutions that it will try comes from this first. And the only thing that you do is you create an S3 bucket, you create a vector store, and you hook it up. One thing though, if you're going to try this, the minimum pricing for OpenSearch, I think, is something like $250 per month. So don't leave it running. Don't leave it running the entire month, because it's going to be, it will add up. But yeah, this is pretty straightforward to set up. This is essentially just, you go to the agent, you say, hey, I want a knowledge base, you create an S3 bucket, you upload your things to the S3 bucket, and that's essentially it.
I think it was the overtime already.
Oh, sorry. Last one then. Yeah.
When you set up your schema in your action group, right? Can you change it dynamically?
Yes.
And when does it load? Does it load like when you start the conversation, or can it also be like, can you trigger it like a certain?
No, it's loaded at the start of the conversation.
Okay.
I don't think you can modify that inline. Yeah. So that was the last one.
That's the last one. Thank you. All right. So another question.
Thank you all.